Dr. Priya Nakamura had spent 14 years building a career on the principle that Assyriology required rigor above all else. Careful, methodical translation work that resisted the sensationalist pull toward ancient astronaut theories that had for decades made her field an easy target for pseudo-archaeological speculation she'd spent her entire professional life quietly, patiently correcting. Which was precisely why, standing in the climate-controlled storage room of the British Museum's cuneiform collection on a Tuesday afternoon in March, staring at a tablet fragment that had been misfiled and forgotten in a box of unremarkable administrative records for nearly a century, she found herself questioning everything she thought she understood about the limits of careful, evidence-based scholarship. The fragment had come to her attention almost by accident, flagged during a routine digitization project meant to catalog thousands of unremarkable cuneiform tablets, receipts, tax records, administrative minutiae from ancient Mesopotamia that made up the overwhelming bulk of the surviving textual record. Considerably less glamorous than the epic literature and mythology that captured public imagination. A junior researcher, cross-referencing tablet fragments against known collections, had noticed that this particular piece, catalogued generically as administrative fragment provenance uncertain, contained a section of text that didn't match any known administrative formula. Priya had approached the fragment initially with the careful skepticism her training demanded. Misfiled tablets were common enough, and anomalous text sections often turned out to be scribal errors, damaged sections that garbled otherwise mundane content, or simply text she hadn't yet properly contextualized against the broader corpus. But 3 weeks of careful translation work, cross-referencing the fragment's unusual vocabulary against the full range of known Sumerian and Akkadian textual sources, had produced something that resisted every conventional explanation she'd initially reached for. The fragment referenced, in careful, measured administrative language, remarkably similar to other texts documenting temple inventories and ritual protocols, something the text called, in a term that didn't appear in any other known Sumerian source she or her colleagues had been able to locate, the Ershetu Nammu, roughly translatable, with the careful hedging proper scholarship required for a term this poorly attested, as the Earth's first depth, or the primordial ground beneath. The text described this Ershetu Nammu not as a deity in the conventional sense the Mesopotamian pantheon typically employed, but as something the scribes seemed to treat with a peculiar, unusual caution. References to sealing, to protocols for approach that involved specific ritual purification considerably more elaborate than standard temple practice, to warnings, rendered in language the fragment's damaged state left frustratingly incomplete, about disturbance and consequence that read, even through Priya's careful, professionally skeptical translation, with an unmistakable weight of genuine ancient anxiety, rather than the more formulaic ritual language typical of standard temple protocol texts. Most strikingly, the fragment referenced a specific location, a description of geographic features that, cross-referenced against known ancient Mesopotamian geography, seemed to correspond to a region in what was now southern Iraq, though the specific site description didn't match any currently excavated or catalogued archaeological location Priya was aware of. She brought the fragment to her department head, Dr. Marcus Webb. Not the same Marcus Webb from other unrelated stories, but a decorated senior Assyriologist whose own career had been built on exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous scholarship Priya herself practiced, and watched his initial skepticism, the same professional caution she'd brought to her own first examination of the fragment, gradually give way, over the following weeks of collaborative translation work, to something closer to genuine, carefully guarded excitement. "If this is authentic," Marcus said, during one of their increasingly frequent late-evening translation sessions, and I want to stress the considerable "if" built into that statement, given how many pieces of this puzzle remain frustratingly incomplete. We're looking at evidence of a textual tradition that predates or exists parallel to the conventional Mesopotamian pantheon in ways the current scholarly consensus has no framework to properly account for. "You're thinking about the Anunnaki texts," Priya said, naming directly the comparison she knew both of them had been carefully circling without quite voicing it, aware of exactly how much professional risk attached to even raising the association, given decades of pseudo-archaeological speculation that had made serious scholars deeply wary of any research that risked association with ancient astronaut theorizing. "I'm thinking," Marcus said carefully, "that the conventional Anunnaki texts describe a pantheon of deities firmly embedded within recognizable Mesopotamian religious structure. Powerful, certainly, and subject to no shortage of fringe misappropriation by people determined to read ancient astronauts into perfectly ordinary ancient mythology. But this fragment isn't describing a deity within that structure. It's describing something the scribes themselves seem to treat as predating or existing outside that structure entirely. Something they approach with a caution that reads to me as qualitatively different from how these same texts typically describe even their most powerful deities. The careful, painstaking work of properly authenticating and contextualizing the fragment occupied the following 4 months, a process considerably slower and more methodical than either researcher's private excitement wanted to permit, precisely because both of them understood exactly how much professional credibility was at stake in making claims this significant without airtight, defensible evidence. They traced the fragment's likely provenance through careful archival research, eventually locating shipping records suggesting it had been part of a larger collection excavated from an unremarkable administrative site near ancient Nippur in the early 20th century, catalogued hastily alongside thousands of similarly mundane administrative records by excavators who had evidently never properly examined this particular fragment's actual content before it was shipped, stored, and eventually forgotten for nearly 100 years. They cross-referenced the fragment's unusual vocabulary against every available comparative source, eventually locating 2 additional, previously uncatalogued fragments in a private collection, whose owner, once approached with careful professional diplomacy, granted access that revealed additional textual context, references to a specific ritual protocol for what the fragments described as maintaining the seal, performed by a specialized priesthood, the fragments referred to by a title that, cross-referenced against the broader Mesopotamian religious record, appeared nowhere else in the known textual corpus, suggesting either an extremely obscure, poorly attested cultic tradition, or something considerably stranger that neither researcher was yet prepared to fully articulate, even to each other. It was Priya who finally proposed, during a translation session that had stretched past midnight, the possibility neither of them had quite allowed themselves to state directly. "What if this isn't describing something mythological at all?" she said. "What if the caution, the sealing protocols, the specific geographic description, what if this text is describing something the ancient scribes understood as a genuine physical location, containing something they believed required careful, deliberate concealment, recorded with the same careful administrative precision they applied to genuinely physical temple inventories and construction records?" The decision to pursue physical verification of the fragment's geographic description carried professional risks that occupied considerable debate between Priya, Marcus, and eventually a small, carefully assembled team of collaborating specialists. A geoarchaeologist named Dr. Amara Chen, whose expertise in ground-penetrating radar and remote sensing technology had proven invaluable in numerous previous Mesopotamian excavation projects, and a specialist in ancient Mesopotamian ritual architecture named Dr. Farouk Hassan, whose careful, evidence-based approach to interpreting temple and ritual site construction Priya had long respected from his previous published work. "I want to be extremely clear," Marcus told the assembled team during their first formal planning meeting, held with deliberate discretion in a small conference room rather than any of the department's more visible spaces, "about exactly what we are and aren't claiming here. We have a textual fragment describing something the ancient scribes clearly regarded with unusual caution. We have a geographic description that may or may not correspond to an actual, physically verifiable location. We do not have, and should not imply we have any evidence whatsoever supporting the kind of ancient astronaut speculation that our field has spent decades carefully distancing itself from. Whatever we find, if we find anything at all, beyond an empty stretch of desert corresponding to a garbled or poorly preserved textual description, will require the same rigorous, evidence-based interpretation we'd apply to any other archaeological discovery. The expedition itself, arranged through careful diplomatic coordination with Iraqi antiquities authorities, and conducted under proper permits and collaborative oversight that Priya insisted upon from the outset, precisely because she understood the considerable historical damage caused by decades of Western archaeological expeditions that had treated the region's cultural heritage with far less respect and collaborative partnership than proper scholarship required, took nearly 6 months to properly organize. Layla Rashid, the Iraqi antiquities official assigned to oversee the expedition's compliance with proper collaborative protocols, proved over the following months of careful joint planning to be an invaluable partner, whose own deep expertise in the region's archaeological history and whose careful professional skepticism about the fragment's more sensational potential implications helped ground the entire team's approach in exactly the kind of methodical rigor the discovery's significance demanded. I've seen too many Western expeditions arrive with grand theories that collapse the moment they're subjected to proper scrutiny, she told Priya during one of their early planning calls, her tone carrying the particular weary directness of someone who had spent a career carefully protecting her country's archaeological heritage from exactly this kind of speculative overreach. If what you're describing is genuine, it will withstand careful, patient verification. If it's not, better to discover that early, before any premature announcement damages both your own credibility and the broader field's already precarious relationship with careful public trust. The site itself, once the team's geoarchaeological survey work using Amara's ground-penetrating radar equipment had narrowed the search area based on Priya's careful cross-referencing of the fragment's geographic description against known ancient watercourses and settlement patterns, proved to be an unremarkable stretch of desert, perhaps 40 kilometers from the nearest known excavated Mesopotamian site, showing no surface indication whatsoever of the kind of anomaly the team's careful ground-penetrating radar surveys eventually revealed, roughly 11 meters beneath the surface. The anomaly, once properly mapped through weeks of careful methodical survey work, showed a geometric regularity that argued strongly against natural geological formation, a structure, buried and apparently deliberately concealed, that Amara's radar imaging suggested extended across a considerably larger footprint than any team member had initially anticipated, based on the fragment's admittedly incomplete textual description. "I want everyone to understand," Farouk said, during the team's careful planning discussion about how to proceed with actual excavation, that whatever we find down there, our approach needs to prioritize proper preservation and documentation over speed. If this structure has remained sealed and undisturbed for as long as the textual evidence suggests, we have a responsibility to excavate it with the same careful, methodical patience the ancient scribes apparently exercised in sealing it in the first place. The excavation itself, conducted over the following 4 months, with a level of careful, methodical patience that tested every team member's professional discipline against the mounting excitement of watching a genuinely unprecedented discovery gradually emerge from careful, painstaking work, revealed a structure that none of the team's collective decades of Mesopotamian archaeological experience had properly prepared them to interpret. The outer chamber, once properly excavated and stabilized, showed construction techniques that Farouk's careful architectural analysis suggested predated, by a considerable margin, the earliest known Mesopotamian construction the archaeological record had previously documented. Stonework fitted with a precision that argued for either remarkably sophisticated early engineering the current archaeological timeline had never credited to the region's earliest known cultures, or, considerably more unsettling in its implications, evidence of a cultural tradition the current archaeological record hadn't yet properly identified or dated at all. The chamber's interior, once the team's careful excavation work finally allowed proper access, nearly 5 months into the expedition, revealed a series of carved reliefs and inscriptions that immediately consumed the attention of every specialist on the team, each bringing their own careful, disciplined expertise to bear on a discovery that resisted easy categorization within any existing framework the field's collective scholarship had previously developed. The inscriptions, once Priya's careful translation work, began the painstaking process of rendering the chamber's extensive textual content into something the team could properly analyze, described a narrative that none of the assembled specialists had encountered in any previously known Mesopotamian source, a narrative rendered in language considerably more archaic than even the earliest known Sumerian texts the field's current chronology had documented. An account, rendered in language considerably more archaic than even the earliest known Sumerian texts the field's current chronology had documented, of what the inscriptions referred to, using the same unusual term the original fragment had introduced, as the Ershetu Nammu. "This isn't describing a deity," Priya told the assembled team, some weeks into the painstaking translation work, her voice carrying the particular careful excitement of a scholar working through implications she understood required considerably more caution than her own private fascination wanted to permit. "The language here is consistently different from how these same texts describe even their most powerful conventional deities. This is describing something the ancient scribes seem to have understood as predating their own pantheon entirely. A presence, or a force, or possibly, though I want to be extremely careful about how speculative this interpretation is, an actual physical entity that existed on Earth before the conventional Mesopotamian cosmology's own account of divine and cosmic origin." The chamber's central feature, once fully excavated and stabilized under Farouk's careful architectural oversight, proved to be a sealed vault, considerably more elaborate in its construction than the outer chamber's already sophisticated stonework. A structure incorporating, Amara's detailed material analysis eventually confirmed, metallurgical techniques and material compositions that her own considerable expertise in ancient Near Eastern archaeological materials couldn't immediately account for within any known ancient technological tradition. "I need to be extremely careful about how I characterize this," Amara told the team, during a tense discussion about how to properly document and interpret the vault's unusual construction, "because I understand exactly how easily this kind of finding gets seized upon by exactly the kind of ancient astronaut speculation our field has spent decades trying to responsibly counter. But I cannot currently identify, using any comparative database available to me, a known ancient technological tradition that would account for the specific material properties I'm measuring in this vault's construction. That doesn't mean the explanation is anything beyond an ancient technological tradition our current archaeological record simply hasn't yet properly documented. It means I don't currently have a satisfying conventional explanation, and I think intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that gap, rather than forcing a premature conventional explanation onto evidence that doesn't yet fully support it." The vault's opening, conducted with painstaking care over several additional weeks once the team had properly documented every aspect of its exterior construction, and consulted extensively with structural engineers about the safest possible method of access, revealed a chamber considerably smaller than the team's collective anticipation had prepared them for. A modest space, perhaps 4 meters across, containing what appeared, once properly illuminated by the team's careful, indirect lighting equipment, to be a single object resting on a raised platform at the chamber's center. The object itself defied every team member's initial attempts at conventional categorization. A roughly spherical form, perhaps a meter in diameter, constructed from a material that Amara's careful analysis, conducted with extensive caution and multiple independent verification methods, precisely because the initial readings seemed so genuinely unprecedented, suggested incorporated properties considerably beyond what any known ancient or even considerably more modern manufacturing tradition could readily explain. "I want to run these results through independent verification before any of us draw conclusions," Amara insisted, watching her own analytical equipment produce readings that challenged every framework her considerable professional training had prepared her to properly interpret. But preliminary analysis suggests this object's material composition doesn't match any known naturally occurring or ancient manufactured substance in our comparative databases. I'm not prepared to speculate about what that actually means. I'm only prepared to say, with appropriate scientific caution, that we have discovered something genuinely unprecedented, and that unprecedented discoveries deserve considerably more careful, patient verification than premature sensational interpretation. The months that followed the object's discovery brought a period of intense, carefully guarded scientific investigation that tested the entire team's professional discipline against mounting public and institutional pressure. Once word of the expedition's unprecedented findings began, despite the team's careful efforts at controlled disclosure, to circulate through academic and eventually broader media channels, the Iraqi government, working closely with Dr. Rashid's careful oversight, insisted on and received full jurisdiction over the object's continued study, a decision Priya and the rest of the international team fully supported, understanding both the ethical necessity of respecting the host nation's sovereignty over its own archaeological heritage, and the practical wisdom of ensuring the investigation proceeded through careful, accountable institutional channels, rather than the kind of chaotic, sensationalized circus that premature, poorly controlled disclosure of a discovery this significant might otherwise have produced. The careful scientific analysis conducted over the following year, drawing on an expanding team of specialists from multiple disciplines and multiple countries, working always under Dr. Rashid's careful institutional oversight, and always with painstaking attention to proper scientific method and peer review, gradually built a body of evidence that resisted easy, comfortable explanation, even as it accumulated considerable rigor and specificity. The object's material composition, once properly analyzed through multiple independent laboratories using methods designed to eliminate any possibility of contamination or measurement error, showed isotopic ratios that several of the assembled physicists, brought into the collaborative investigation specifically for their expertise in exactly this kind of unusual material analysis, found genuinely difficult to reconcile with any known terrestrial geological or manufacturing process, though every scientist involved remained careful in their published preliminary findings to note that unusual isotopic signatures could potentially result from geological processes the current scientific understanding hadn't yet properly documented, rather than necessarily implying anything more exotic. I keep returning to the same careful caveat, Priya told a gathering of the full research team during one of their regular collaborative review sessions, nearly 18 months into the ongoing investigation, which is that unprecedented evidence requires proportionally rigorous verification before we draw conclusions that outpace what the evidence actually conservatively supports. We have a textual tradition describing something the ancient scribes treated with unusual caution. We have a physically verified structure, predating known Mesopotamian construction techniques by a considerable margin. We have an object with material properties that current scientific understanding cannot fully explain. None of that, individually or collectively, constitutes proof of anything beyond what it literally, conservatively demonstrates: a genuinely unprecedented archaeological discovery that our current frameworks, both textual and scientific, don't yet have complete tools to properly interpret. The textual analysis, continuing in careful parallel with the object's physical scientific investigation, eventually revealed additional context within the chamber's extensive inscriptions that helped, if not fully resolve, at least considerably deepen the team's understanding of what the ancient scribes had apparently believed they were sealing away. The inscriptions described, in language Priya's continued careful translation work rendered with increasing confidence as her understanding of the text's unusual vocabulary deepened, an account of the Ershetu Nammu as something the ancient tradition understood not as a threat requiring destruction, but as a form of knowledge or presence requiring careful, patient stewardship. Sealed away, not out of fear exactly, but out of a considered, deliberate judgment that the world of that ancient era wasn't yet prepared to properly receive or responsibly steward whatever the object actually represented. There's language here, Priya explained to the assembled team, presenting her latest translation work with the careful, measured excitement that had come to characterize her approach to the entire investigation. That describes a kind of covenant, or agreement, between the sealing priesthood and whatever authority they understood themselves to be answering to. A commitment to maintain the seal until conditions arose that would allow the Ershetu Nammu to be properly received rather than misused. I want to be extremely careful about how I characterize this interpretation, because the text's damaged sections leave considerable ambiguity, but the pattern here reads, to my careful scholarly judgment, considerably more like a deliberate act of patient stewardship across an anticipated span of time, than like the kind of purely defensive sealing away of a threat narrative that popular ancient-astronaut speculation might predict. The formal scientific and archaeological publication of the team's findings, when it finally occurred, nearly 3 years after Priya's original discovery of the misfiled fragment in the British Museum's storage room, proceeded through exactly the careful, rigorous peer review process the entire team had insisted upon from the outset, precisely because they understood how essential proper institutional verification would be for a discovery whose implications, however carefully hedged and conservatively presented, would inevitably attract exactly the kind of sensationalized public attention and speculative overreach that could easily undermine the discovery's genuine scientific and historical significance. The published findings, appearing simultaneously across multiple peer-reviewed journals in archaeology, Assyriology, and material science, presented the discovery with the same careful, methodical caution that had characterized the entire investigation: detailed documentation of the chamber's construction and dating, careful translation and contextualization of the extensive textual inscriptions, rigorous, multiply verified scientific analysis of the object's genuinely unprecedented material properties, all presented with the explicit, repeated caveat that the findings documented genuinely unprecedented evidence requiring continued careful study, rather than definitive conclusions about the object's ultimate origin or nature. I understand, Priya told a gathering of international journalists during the carefully managed press conference that accompanied the formal publication, fielding, with the same careful discipline she'd brought to the entire investigation, the inevitable flood of questions, pushing toward exactly the kind of sensational ancient-astronaut framing the team had worked for years to responsibly avoid. That this discovery will generate considerable public speculation, much of it likely to outpace what our careful, conservative findings actually support. I want to be clear that our team's published research makes no claims whatsoever about extraterrestrial origin, ancient alien visitation, or any of the popular pseudo-archaeological frameworks that I know will inevitably attach themselves to a discovery this unusual. What we have documented, with considerable scientific rigor, is a genuinely unprecedented archaeological structure and object, whose full explanation remains, honestly and conservatively, beyond what our current scientific and historical understanding can completely provide. That gap in explanation is not evidence of anything beyond the genuine limits of current knowledge, and I would ask that responsible reporting reflect that careful distinction rather than filling the gap with speculation our research does not support. The years that followed brought continued careful, methodical study of both the textual and physical evidence, conducted always under the careful institutional oversight Dr. Rashid and the Iraqi government had insisted upon from the discovery's earliest stages, gradually building an expanding body of rigorous scientific understanding, even as certain fundamental questions about the object's ultimate origin and full significance remained, by careful scientific consensus, genuinely unresolved. Priya, reflecting on the discovery's long journey from a misfiled fragment in a museum storage room to a discovery that had reshaped, in careful, methodical ways, the field's understanding of ancient Mesopotamian textual tradition and technological capacity, found herself returning often to a particular passage from the chamber's inscriptions that her continued translation work had helped render with increasing clarity, over the years of ongoing study. "There's a line," she told a graduate seminar of her own students, years after the discovery's initial publication. The object itself continuing its careful, ongoing scientific study, under secure Iraqi institutional oversight. Its ultimate origin and full nature still, honestly, not completely resolved, despite years of rigorous, patient investigation. That I've come to think of as the discovery's real lesson, more than any of the sensational speculation that inevitably attached itself to our findings, despite our careful efforts to prevent it. The ancient scribes wrote that the Ershetu Nammu would remain properly sealed until those who sought it approached with patience equal to the patience of its keeping. I think about that line often, because I think it describes as well as anything I could say myself exactly what proper scholarship actually requires. Not the rush toward sensational conclusion that popular imagination always wants from discoveries like this, but the genuine, difficult patience to sit honestly with what we don't yet know, for as long as honest, rigorous investigation actually requires, before claiming understanding we haven't actually earned. The object itself remained, at the time of Priya's retrospective seminar years later, still not fully explained. Its material properties documented with considerable scientific rigor, its ancient context understood with increasing textual clarity, but its ultimate nature and origin still, by careful scientific consensus, genuinely open, a genuine mystery that continued to resist easy resolution despite years of patient, methodical, collaborative investigation. "I used to think," Priya told her students, in the seminar's closing minutes, "that my career would be built on careful, rigorous work, correcting other people's sensational misreadings of ancient texts. I never expected that career to eventually include a discovery genuinely strange enough that my own careful, rigorous methods couldn't fully resolve it either." I think that's an important lesson too, that intellectual honesty sometimes means arriving, after years of careful, patient work, not at a tidy answer, but at a genuinely open question, held with the same rigor and care you'd bring to any answer you actually could defend. The Ershetu Nammu taught me that patience, in the end, matters more than the resolution I originally hoped my career would eventually provide.